Hey everybody, it's Akil Aline again, here with See Through Edu. I decided I wanted to share something with you tonight, a statement that an American national treasure by the name of Whoopi Goldberg made on her show, The View, not too long ago. Observe.
There are certain things that we know as a society we're not going to do. You're not going to walk into a theater and yell fire.
Yes.
You're not going to do that because you know that's going to panic people. It could start all kinds of things.
The law.
There are certain things that we all as a society say, no, we're not going to do that.
Whoopi, whoopie, whoopie. Whoopi, whoopie, whoopie. Hasn't anyone told you that statement, that quote, "You can't shout fire in a crowded theater," is one of the most misleading misquotations in all of the history of American political discourse. First of all, that statement isn't even an accurate quote. It originates with the Supreme Court case of Schenck versus United States about 100 years ago. In that case, writing for a unanimous Supreme Court, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote, "The most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic." Note, one word that quote includes that Whoopi Goldberg's formulation and the formulation that you usually hear, the most cliched formulation, doesn't include. It includes the word falsely. Oliver Wendell Holmes made that statement in a case concerning a man who was arrested for distributing flyers that advocated against the draft during the First World War. Unfortunately, this was an era of American history when the courts in general and the Supreme Court in particular had not yet begun to get serious about protecting the First Amendment right to free speech like it deserves to be protected. So unfortunately, the court actually upheld the punishment of Charles Schenck under the Espionage Act that was passed during the war on the grounds that that kind of speech somehow posed a clear and present danger to the country in wartime. That quote, in Justice Holmes' opinion, was used at the time and has been used ever since, misused of course, to defend and advocate and make excuses for censorship of all kinds. Not for another 50 years after that case was handed down would the Supreme Court finally overturn it by establishing that the clear and present danger test no longer applies. Even inflammatory speech is protected by the First Amendment unless it constitutes incitement to imminent lawless action and unless it is likely to lead to such imminent lawless action. The mere advocacy of a controversial viewpoint or a viewpoint that somehow puts a stick in the spokes of the government's policies to censor that kind of speech doesn't cut it. It does not pass the First Amendment muster anymore since 1969 in the Supreme Court case of Brandenburg versus Ohio. However, even in the aftermath of Schenck versus the United States, not only did the Supreme Court as a whole begin to move away from that mistake in its jurisprudence, even Justice Holmes himself began to move away from that viewpoint, that narrow, constrained, constricted interpretation of the First Amendment as early as later that very same year, 1919. In a case called Abrams versus the United States, in which Justice Holmes himself actually handed down an opinion that was much more consistent with the proper understanding of the First Amendment, which predominates today and which is part of Supreme Court jurisprudence to this very day. In that case, Justice Holmes defended the idea that ideas that are perceived by some to be dangerous to American society are best combated through the marketplace of ideas rather than through government censorship. So, right off the bat, most folks who repeat that quote simply aren't familiar with the history behind it, they're not familiar with its highly problematic origins, and they don't even get the wording of the quote correct. I'm not just nitpicking here. The misquotation is material. It matters. It's relevant. It's important. There's a big difference between falsely shouting fire in a theater, which is what Justice Holmes actually referred to, and shouting fire in a crowded theater when there actually is a fire. Many legal analysts have already been over this. If you're in a theater and you see a fire, you actually not only can shout fire, but you probably should. Or if not shouting, you should find some way to let the other folks in the theater know that there's a danger to their lives and safety so they can hightail it out of there. You definitely shouldn't just keep your mouth shut and keep your realization to yourself. So Whoopi, like so many other people, like most people nowadays who quote that misbegotten statement, simply gets the law, as well as the quotation itself, tragically wrong. Now, what's the larger, more fundamental point that folks are generally trying to get at when they repeat that cliche? Obviously, they're trying to say, yes, we have the right to free speech, but free speech has its limits, and those limits would exclude from protection any speech that poses some kind of danger to the public. Obviously, yes, there are some limits to the right to free speech, some exceptions to that right. Although, as I stated in one of my earlier videos for See Through Edu, hate speech is not one of those exceptions. Even though there are limits to the right to free speech, it's very important to, first of all, be aware of what the limits actually are under Supreme Court First Amendment jurisprudence, which unfortunately a great many of people in society simply aren't familiar with. And it's important that when the courts and others are fashioning those limits, they do so in a way that does not shut off legitimate debate over legitimate free speech. That cliche about shouting fire in a crowded theater has been used to justify or at least excuse censorship of some of the worst kinds, and it's still being used in that way today. So just a cautionary note to Whoopi Goldberg and all the others, please try getting your history, your law, and your quotations right from now on. This is just not good enough.